Tuesday morning, I stepped outside and froze. Karen's Mercedes sat smugly in my garage. Our HOA president was unloading boxes like she owned the place. "What are you doing?" I demanded. She smirked. Amendment 37.2 garages are community storage when needed. Blood boiling. I walked inside, grabbed my remote, and pressed the button. The door descended as Karen's eyes widened. "Just securing my property," I smiled. "With your car locked inside." And that was only the beginning. I never wanted any trouble. After 15 years in the city, battling traffic and noise, I'd finally saved enough for a down payment on a modest home in Oak Ridge Estates. The neighborhood promised peace, quiet, and most importantly, space. As a mechanical engineer who loved tinkering with vintage motorcycles, the two-car garage was what sold me on the property. "This is it," I remember telling my sister during the virtual tour, my own little sanctuary. The first month was blissful. I set up my workshop, organized my tools with meticulous care, and even installed special flooring to catch oil drips from my restoration projects. Every evening after work, I'd spend a few hours in that garage, losing myself in the meditative process of rebuilding engines while listening to classic rock. For the first time in years, I felt content. Then came the HOA welcome packet. Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association had rules. Lots of them. Lawn height specifications down to the quarter-inch. Approved paint colors, all 50 shades of beige. Limitations on holiday decorations, apparently. My planned Halloween display would violate 3 separate bylaws. But I could live with all that. Small price for serenity, right? What I couldn't have anticipated was Karen Wilkinson. Karen had been HOA president for 8 consecutive terms. A former corporate lawyer who'd retired early, she now channeled all that unused ambition into micromanaging our community. Her silver BMW always gleamed immaculately in her driveway, never in her garage, which was rumored to be filled with filing cabinets documenting resident violations. Our first encounter happened 3 weeks after I moved in. She appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," she said, scanning my living room over my shoulder. "I noticed your recycling bin was still on the curb at 8:15 this morning. Section 12. 4 clearly states all bins must be removed by 8 AM sharp." I apologized, explained I was still adjusting to the schedule. She nodded, made a note, and left me with a friendly reminder slip that included the $25 fine for first-time offenders. That was just the beginning. Over the next 2 months, I received citations for a garden hose visibly coiled on the side of my house, installing a bird feeder without prior approval, and my personal favorite excessive garage activity after 7:00 p.m. Apparently, my restoration work constituted industrial noise pollution in a residential zone. Then came the April HOA meeting, where Karen unveiled her masterpiece, Amendment 37.2 to the Community Bylaws. The Community Resource Optimization Initiative granted the HOA Board temporary access rights to underutilized community assets, including incredibly private garages, when deemed necessary for community functions and operations. The amendment passed 3-2, with Karen breaking the tie. I approached her after the meeting. "This can't possibly be legal," I said. "You can't just declare people's private property to be community resources." Karen's smile was glacial. "Actually, when you purchased your home, you agreed to abide by all HOA regulations, including future amendments. Your garage is part of the community aesthetic and subject to community governance. Perhaps you should have read the covenant more carefully." I consulted a lawyer friend who confirmed my worst fears. Challenging the HOA would be expensive, time-consuming, and with no guarantee of success. These associations have surprising legal authority, he warned. Your best bet is to work within the system or move. Moving wasn't an option. I'd sunk everything I had into this house. So I tried diplomacy. I invited Karen over for coffee, showed her my restoration projects, explained how important this space was to me. She nodded politely, admired my vintage Triumph motorcycle, then informed me that the HOA would be using my garage for their quarterly board meeting the following Tuesday. Your space is perfect, she said, running her finger along my workbench. So much roomier than the community center. And we need somewhere to store the holiday decorations temporarily while the storage shed is being renovated. When I objected, her expression hardened. This isn't a request, Mr. Mitchell. It's a courtesy notification. The amendment is already in effect. That Tuesday morning, finding Karen's Mercedes in my garage wasn't a surprise, it was the final straw. As I stood there watching her casually dismiss my property rights, something inside me snapped. I knew that if I continued to yield, I would never find peace in my own home. The morning after finding Karen's car in my garage, I installed a security camera above my driveway. Nothing illegal about that, just a simple precaution for a homeowner concerned about his property. I needed documentation of what was happening because no one would believe it otherwise. The footage didn't disappoint. At 7:15 and the next day, Karen returned with her BMW and a trunk full of plastic storage bins. She punched in the garage code, how did she even get that? And proceeded to rearrange my workbench to make room for her containers. My carefully organized tools were pushed aside, some falling to the floor with metallic clangs that made me wince watching the playback. She didn't even flinch. When I confronted her that evening, her response was chilling in its casualness. Oh, those? Just some HOA decorations for the summer festival. Your garage has the most suitable climate control for proper storage. She smiled that practiced smile. Don't worry, it's only temporary. 3 months, maybe 4. This is unacceptable, I said, struggling to keep my voice level. You can't just commandeer my garage for personal storage. Karen's smile never faltered. It's not personal storage, Mr. Mitchell. These are community assets. And according to Amendment 37.2, which you agreed to by continuing your residency here, the HOA has allocation rights to underutilized spaces. Underutilized? I use this garage every day for hobby activities that could easily be conducted elsewhere. The community's needs take precedence. She checked her watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have dinner plans. The next morning, I found an official HOA notice taped to my front door. Violation: obstruction of community resource access. Apparently, I had committed the grave offense of parking my own car in my own garage overnight, preventing Karen from accessing her storage containers. The fine, $150 per day until compliance was achieved. I tore up the notice and drafted a formal complaint to the HOA board, detailing Karen's abuse of power and the illegitimacy of Amendment 37.2, 37.2, 37.2. I cited property laws, quoted the original HOA covenant, and attached photos of my garage being used as Karen's personal storage unit. 3 days later, I received the board's response, complaint denied. Amendment 37.2 was properly ratified according to HOA bylaws. Further disruption of community operations may result in additional penalties. It was signed by all 5 board members, Karen's hand-picked allies who rubber-stamped her every whim. That weekend, I consulted with 3 different property lawyers. The first 2 gave me the same disheartening news. Fighting the HOA would be expensive and protracted. The third, a fiery woman named Diane, gave me a glimmer of hope. This amendment is pushing legal boundaries, she said, reviewing the documents. But challenging it would cost upwards of $10,000 with no guarantee of success. These cases often drag on for years. Money I didn't have, time I couldn't waste. I decided on a different approach. I would attend the next HOA meeting and appeal directly to my neighbors. Surely they could see how absurd this situation had become. Surely they wouldn't want their own garages commandeered next. The community center was packed that Tuesday evening. I waited patiently through discussions of landscaping contracts and pool maintenance before raising my hand during the open forum. I'd like to address Amendment 37.2, I began, my heart hammering. I believe it represents an unprecedented overreach of HOA authority into private property rights. Before I could continue, Karen interrupted. Mr. Mitchell, if you have a personal grievance, please follow the proper channels for filing complaints. I did. It was denied without consideration. Then the matter is settled. She attempted to move on, but I stood my ground. It's not settled. My garage is being used as personal storage for items that have nothing to do with community functions. My car was ticketed for being in my own garage. A murmur rippled through the room. Some neighbors looked confused, others uncomfortable. I pressed on, describing the storage containers, the arbitrary fines, the late-night access to my property. Karen's composure cracked slightly. Those decorations are for the community festival that benefits everyone here. Mr. Mitchell is being selfish with space he barely uses. To my surprise, my next-door neighbor, Dave, spoke up. I've seen Mitchell working in that garage almost every evening. It's clearly not unused space. Thank you, I said, relieved to have an ally. But then Margaret from across the street chimed in. If the board determined the space is needed for community purposes, we should trust their judgment. They're elected to make these decisions. Exactly, Karen nodded approvingly. And may I remind everyone that property values in Oak Ridge have increased 15% under current leadership. Our regulations protect your investments. The room divided visibly. Some neighbors nodded in agreement with Karen. Others looked troubled but remained silent. I realized with sinking clarity that fear was a powerful motivator in Oak Ridge Estates. No one wanted to be Karen's next target. The meeting adjourned with no resolution. As people filed out, a few neighbors patted my shoulder sympathetically, but offered no real support. Dave whispered, "She's done this before. The Johnsons moved out last year after she decided their backyard was perfect for community composting." 2 days later, I returned home from work to find a police cruiser in my driveway. Officer Reynolds, whom I recognized from community events, looked uncomfortable as Karen stood beside him, arms crossed triumphantly. "Mr. Mitchell has been obstructing HOA operations," she informed the officer. "We need access to community storage that he's deliberately blocking." Officer Reynolds sighed. "Sir, one understand this is a civil matter, but Miss Wilkinson insisted I explain that HOA regulations are legally binding contracts." I felt my face burning with humiliation as neighbors peeked through windows and slowed their walks to observe the spectacle. "Officer, she's using my private garage as her personal storage unit. I'm just here to keep the peace," he replied quietly. "This needs to be resolved through proper channels." As they left, Karen turned back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be by tomorrow morning to rearrange those storage containers. Please ensure your vehicle is not obstructing access." That night, I couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., headlights swept across my bedroom wall. I rushed to the window to see Karen's Mercedes pulling into my driveway. She entered my garage, spent 20 minutes moving things around, and left. My security camera captured it all, her smug expression as she punched in my code, The casual way she pushed my motorcycle against the wall to make room for more containers, her complete disregard for my property and privacy. Something inside me broke, not in a way that made me want to lash out violently. I'm not that person. But in a way that crystallized my resolve. This wasn't just about a garage anymore. This was about dignity. About standing up to a bully who had terrorized an entire neighborhood into submission. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, researching HOA laws, property rights, and community bylaws. If Karen wanted to play by the rules, I would learn every single rule, and then I would use them against her. If they want to play hardball, I whispered to myself as the sun rose, they have no idea who they're dealing with. After 3 sleepless nights of research, I found my ammunition. Not in obscure legal loopholes, but in plain sight. The county property records and the original HOA covenant that predated Karen's reign. My garage was explicitly listed as private property in the deed. More importantly, the founding HOA covenant contained a crucial clause. No amendment may infringe upon the exclusive use rights of deeded private spaces without 100% owner consent. Karen's Amendment 37.2 had passed with a mere board majority, not unanimous homeowner approval. I called Diane, the fiery lawyer, with my findings. "This is exactly what we need," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. "The amendment is fundamentally invalid. They can't enforce what was never legally enacted." "What's my next move?" I asked. "Document everything, and I mean everything. Then we strike." For the next week, I meticulously recorded Karen's comings and goings. The security camera captured her entering my garage at odd hours, sometimes as late as 11 p.m. I photographed every item she stored there, noting how they displaced my belongings. I recorded conversations with neighbors who admitted they feared similar treatment. Meanwhile, I quietly had a locksmith install a new garage door opener system, one with rolling codes that changed after each use. The old code Karen had somehow obtained would soon be useless. I also ordered a heavy-duty parking boot, the kind used by parking enforcement. It arrived on Thursday, and I hid it in my trunk, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came on Saturday morning. Karen's routine had become predictable. She arrived early on weekends to organize her storage containers, which now occupied nearly 2/3 of my garage space. At 7:30 a.m., my security alert pinged. Karen's Mercedes pulled into my driveway. She frowned when her code didn't work, then pressed the intercom button I'd installed. "Mr. Mitchell, your garage code seems to be malfunctioning," she said, her voice tight with irritation. I pressed the remote opener from inside my house, watching through the window as she entered. Once she was inside, rummaging through her containers, I quietly slipped out my side door and approached the garage. Karen didn't notice me until I spoke. "Good morning, Karen." She startled, nearly dropping the box of holiday lights she was holding. "What are you doing sneaking around like that?" "I'm not sneaking. I'm entering my own garage." I stepped inside, positioning myself between her and the door. "We need to talk about this situation." Her eyes narrowed. "There's nothing to discuss. The board has overstepped its authority," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "Amendment 37.2 is invalid. It violates the original covenant, requiring unanimous consent for amendments affecting private property rights." Karen's composure slipped for just a moment before she recovered. "That's your interpretation. Our HOA attorney approved the amendment. Did your attorney review the original covenant from 1992? Because I have. I held up a copy, key passages highlighted, and I've consulted with my own attorney, who specializes in property law. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen looked uncertain, but she quickly masked it with indignation. This is harassment. I'm here on official HOA business. No, Karen, you're trespassing. I gestured to the security camera. I have weeks of footage showing you entering my garage without permission, moving my belongings, and storing your personal items here. Those are community decorations. Really? Because I checked with the event planning committee. They know nothing about holiday decorations being stored in my garage. In fact, I walked over and opened one of her containers, revealing designer shoes still in their boxes. These don't look like community property to me. Karen's face flushed, deep red. How dare you go through my things? Your things. I thought these were community assets. I smiled thinly. You can't have it both ways. She grabbed her purse. This conversation is over. I'm leaving, and you'll be hearing from the HOA attorney. Actually, I said, pressing the garage door opener, you can leave, but your car stays. As the door closed behind us, I quickly attached the parking boot to her Mercedes front wheel. The heavy-duty lock clicked into place with satisfying finality. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. What do you think you're doing? Remove that immediately. I can't do that, I replied calmly. Your vehicle is improperly stored on my private property without consent. According to County Ordinance 47.3, I'm within my rights to immobilize unauthorized vehicles until proper removal can be arranged. This is outrageous. She fumbled for her phone. I'm calling the police. Please do. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. I have all the documentation they'll need. 30 minutes later, Officer Reynolds stood in my driveway again, looking even more uncomfortable than before. Karen had worked herself into a state of righteous fury, demanding my arrest for vehicle tampering. I calmly presented my documentation, property deed, original covenant, security footage, and the county ordinance regarding unauthorized parking. Officer Reynolds reviewed everything carefully, then sighed. Miss Wilkinson, this appears to be a civil matter. The garage is clearly deeded as Mr. Mitchell's private property, and there's no evidence of a valid agreement allowing HOA storage. But the amendment, Karen sputtered, would need to be enforced through civil court, he interrupted gently. And based on these documents, Mr. Mitchell has reasonable grounds to question its validity. Karen's face contorted with rage. So you're just going to let him hold my car hostage? I'm not taking sides here, Officer Reynolds replied. But he's offered to remove the boot if you remove your belongings from his garage. That seems like a reasonable compromise. Karen glared at me with pure hatred. Fine, I'll move my things. But this isn't over, Mitchell. Actually, it is, I said, handing her an envelope. This is a cease and desist letter from my attorney, along with notice of intent to sue for trespassing, harassment, and abuse of HOA authority if you don't comply with the following terms. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope and scanned the document inside. The color drained from her face. You want me to resign from the board and pay damages? This is absurd. What's absurd is using your position to bully homeowners and commandeer their private property, I replied. And I'm not the only victim, am I? As if on cue, Dave from next door approached, followed by the Thompsons from across the street and the elderly Mrs. Abernathy from the corner house. Each carried similar envelopes. We've all had enough, Karen, Dave said quietly. Mitchell here showed us we don't have to take it anymore. Karen looked from face to face, the reality of her situation dawning. You're all suing me? This is a conspiracy. No, it's a community finally standing up to a bully, Mrs. Abernathy said, her voice quavering but determined. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was standing room only. Word had spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Karen sat stiffly at the board table, flanked by her usual allies who now looked uncertain and uncomfortable. I took the podium first, Diane the lawyer at my side. Calmly and methodically, we presented our case: the invalid amendment, the pattern of harassment, the misuse of HOA authority for personal benefit. We're not asking for the dissolution of the HOA, I concluded. We're asking for accountability and a return to the original covenant that protected all homeowners equally. One by one, neighbors stood to share their stories. The Johnsons, who had been forced to move after Karen designated their backyard for community composting. The Garcias, whose children's treehouse was demolished because it violated an obscure height restriction Karen had added. Miss S. Abernathy, who'd been fined repeatedly for her rose garden that Karen deemed excessively colorful. By the time the testimonies ended, even Karen's allies on the board looked shaken. When the vote came to rescind Amendment 37.2 and all other amendments passed without proper homeowner consent, it was unanimous, including Karen's reluctant vote. The following week, Karen resigned from the board. The settlement agreement required her to pay damages to those whose properties she had misused and to issue a formal apology at the next HOA meeting. That apology, delivered through gritted teeth, was brief and barely sincere, but it didn't matter. What mattered was watching her load the last of her community decorations into her car, not from my garage, but from the actual community storage shed where they belonged. As she drove away, Dave clapped me on the shoulder. "You know, we should nominate you for the board. We need someone who actually understands the rules and will stand up for homeowners." I laughed. "Thanks, but I've had enough HOA politics to last a lifetime. All I want now is to enjoy my garage in peace." And that evening, I did exactly that. With my tools back in their proper places, my motorcycle gleaming under the workshop lights, and classic rock playing on the speakers, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving to Oak Ridge Estates. I felt at home. The fallout from Karen's resignation was swift and far-reaching. Within a week, the neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted from Oak Ridge Estates. The interim HOA board, led by Dave and Miss S. Abernathy, wasted no time dismantling Karen's oppressive regime. They organized an emergency community meeting in the clubhouse, where over 80 homeowners gathered to vote on a complete overhaul of the regulations. "For too long," Dave announced, standing confidently at the podium, "we've lived under rules designed to control rather than protect. Tonight, we begin the process of restoring this community to what it was meant to be, a neighborhood where people can actually enjoy their homes." The crowd erupted in applause. I sat quietly in the back row, still processing the dramatic shift in community dynamics. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now greeted each other warmly, sharing stories of Karen's tyranny with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief. Miss S. Abernathy approached the microphone next, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Our first order of business is to formally rescind all amendments passed during the previous administration that did not receive proper homeowner approval. This includes the infamous Amendment 37.2, 37.2, 37.2, 37.2. Another round of applause, even more enthusiastic than before. Several people turned to smile at me, and I felt my cheeks flush with unexpected emotion. "Additionally," she continued, "we will be refunding all improper fines collected in the past 2 years once our audit is complete. Early estimates suggest this amount exceeds $30,000. A collective gasp filled the room. followed by murmurs of astonishment. Karen had been running quite the profitable enterprise at our expense. The meeting continued for nearly 3 hours as neighbors proposed changes, shared grievances, and collectively reimagined what our community could be. By the end, we had voted to eliminate over 30 restrictive regulations, including the infamous approved plant species list that had been Karen's weapon of choice against gardening enthusiasts. As people filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or pat my shoulder. "You showed us it was possible to fight back," one woman said, her eyes brimming with tears. "My daughter can have her butterfly garden now. I hadn't expected to become a neighborhood hero. I'd simply wanted my garage back." But standing there, receiving gratitude from people whose names I was only just learning, I realized how much more had been at stake. 2 days later, a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's colonial-style home. I watched from my driveway as professional movers efficiently loaded her furniture and boxes. Karen herself supervised the process from a distance, sunglasses hiding her eyes, posture rigid with wounded pride. When she noticed me watching, she hesitated, then marched across the street with determined steps. I braced myself for a final confrontation. "I suppose you're satisfied with yourself," she said, her voice tight with restrained anger. I considered my response carefully. "I'm satisfied that people can enjoy their homes again. That's all I ever wanted for myself." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You have no idea what you've done. This neighborhood will fall into chaos without proper oversight. Property values will plummet. You'll regret this." "I don't think so," I replied calmly. "But I wish you well wherever you're going." She seemed momentarily thrown by my civility. "Phoenix," she said after a pause. "My sister lives there, in a community with standards." I nodded. "Good luck, Karen." She turned to leave, then stopped. "You know, I was just trying to maintain quality of life here. Someone had to take charge." "There's a difference between leadership and control," I said. "Maybe you'll find that balance in your next community." She didn't respond, just walked back to her nearly empty house. By sunset, her car was loaded with her last personal belongings, and Karen Wilkinson drove out of Oak Ridge Estates for the final time. 1 month later, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my driveway, and garaged the same space that had been the battleground of our conflict. Children played freely on the street, without fear of being cited for excessive recreational noise. Adults chatted in groups, holding drinks and laughing without constantly glancing over their shoulders. Dave raised his glass in a toast to Mitchell, who taught us all that sometimes you have to stand up for what's yours. Everyone cheered, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Later that evening, after the neighbors had gone home and I was cleaning up, I stood in my garage and looked around with deep satisfaction. My workbench was back in its proper place. My motorcycle gleamed under the lights. My tools hung neatly on their designated hooks. I pressed the button to lower the garage door and watched it descend smoothly, sealing my private space from the outside world not as a barrier, but as a boundary freely chosen and respected. Finally, I said to the quiet space around me, "I've reclaimed what was always mine." And in that moment of perfect contentment, I realized we had all reclaimed something essential, not just our property rights, but our dignity and sense of community. Karen was gone, but Oak Ridge Estates had found its soul again. So, what would you have done in my situation? Was my garage lockdown strategy the perfect revenge, or would you have handled Karen differently? If you think she got exactly what she deserved, type garage justice in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare of your own? Share your story. I'd love to hear how you stood your ground against unreasonable rules and power-hungry board members. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to catch all my upcoming neighborhood drama stories. Next week, I'll be sharing how my neighbor's drone accidentally crashed into my backyard pool during a family barbecue and the absolutely wild confrontation that followed. Remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't just winning, it's winning with style and making them regret they ever crossed you in the first place. See you in the next video.